Welcome, everybody. We're back from spring break. Hope everybody had a good week off, a little relaxing. But now the work begins to finish up the end of the school year. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Before we are being televised this evening, recorded, and before we begin, I want to talk about two people we lost this last week here in this community. One of them very close to our hearts here at this table. Leslie Peterson Schwartz passed away earlier in the week, and it was a real shock to many of us. Her picture's right up here, the third one over from the very end. She served on our board from 1997 to 2009, so 12 years of her service. I was able to serve with her for 3 years, and it was a privilege to serve with her. If she wasn't here serving on our school board, she was up in Sacramento working diligently. A couple things that she did was she was appointed by the State Board of Education to the California State Curriculum Commission, serving from 1998 to 2002. 2005, she was appointed to the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, serving as the chair from 2005 to 2007. So she definitely was involved. Curriculum was her thing. I remember being at these board tables, and whenever there was a curriculum conversation, she looked up and she was present, and she was our go-to person in regards to that. A kind of a running joke, as she said at these board meetings, which she would always look down and she would have her phone and she would be playing like Tetris or something, and just to keep her, you know, involved and familiar with the items, or know what's going on and be focused. It kept her focused, because if it was a facility conversation, it was just not her thing. But when it came to curriculum, I definitely myself was, she was my go-to person, and she will be missed in this community quite a lot. And she also tried to, she ran for city council, was unsuccessful, but she continued to try to do her work in the public and be a part of this community that way. And she continued to do so after that. So again, she will be missed quite a bit in this community. The other person we lost was Rick Warnick. He is a community member. Him and his family live here in Novato for many years. He is a State Farm agent, but in other ways, he was also the past president of Novato Youth Center, which is now the North Marin Community Services. And he was the past president of the Novato Chamber, which are both partners with us here at the school district. And so he has been very involved, being a resident of Novato, and so that's an extreme loss to this community as well. So, is anybody else want to say anything before we move on? Everybody's, yeah, yes.
I had a chance to serve with her, I think, for her entire term. Not only all the work she did at this board, which was always interesting, but her commitment to the programs behind the scenes. She ran the costume shop for the programs for the run-up at San Marin, and the amount of effort that she put in to make sure all those kids were always ready to show their best. There's all the hidden work behind the scenes that made her such an important contributor to the community. She'd always find some way to give more than she got for the town of Novato.
Right.
It's going to be a loss.
So I will adjourn the meeting in both of their honors is what I will do at the end. So thank you. All right, moving on to our business this evening and approval of our agenda. Stands as is. Okay.
Written.
We have a first by Trustee Miller, second by Trustee Nell. All those in favor to approve the agenda? Okay, 5-0. 2 absent, and our 2 absent are Trustee Cooper and Trustee Mack. They had conflicts this evening, so they were unable to obviously be here. We have 1 consent item. This is the approval to add services agreement with Rincon Associations for CEQA services. This is our 1 consent item.
I'll move the consent agenda.
Okay.
I'll second.
A first by Trustee Miller, a second by Trustee Nell to approve the consent agenda, the 1 item. All those in favor? 5-0, 2 absent. All right. Our main item this evening, the 1 item, is our parcel tax study session. We have Charles Heath here. Superintendent Hogaboom is going to do the introductions, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, President Butler. So, as I'm sure the board is aware, we have a parcel tax, and local voters have been generous enough to approve those for us. They approved those initially in 1992, and since then in 1997, 2005, 2009, and 2014. Local voters have overwhelmingly voted to continue the measure. We get about $4 million in funding from the state, and that's local funding that cannot be taken away. It's very specific as to what those parcel tax dollars can be used for. So tonight we are here to talk about a possible successful parcel tax measure in the future. This was a recommendation from the Elementary School Size Committee. So one of the things we looked at was not only cutting costs, but increasing revenue. And some of the things we talked about in terms of revenue were doing some more marketing to get more students to come into the district, renting out facilities, redoing our facilities use agreements, things like that. Increasing revenue is always a difficult proposition, but the parcel tax is one of the probably more significant ways that the district can look at to try to improve our revenue stream in the future. So we have worked quite closely with Charles Heath in the past, and he helped us on numerous bond measures and parcel taxes as well. So he is here to kind of go over some information about a lot of different options that have to do with timing for when we might go out for a parcel tax measure, what the polling might look like, and lay all those options out for the board. This is only a staff report tonight. So if you give us direction, then we'll bring this back possibly next week on the 23rd for an action item. So with that, Charles, we really appreciate your help over the years. You've helped us with a lot of local measures, and we appreciate that. So welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. So as Superintendent Hogaboom mentioned, the last time we renewed the parcel tax here in Novato was in May 2014, and the measure that about 80% of the voters approved at that time extended the existing parcel tax rate of $251 per parcel, but it also included a automatic sunset date of 8 years from the approval of the measure. So in June of 2022, without additional voter action to extend the parcel tax, that funding will expire. Most school districts, because parcel tax funding is such a significant part of their budget and support such important programs, they don't wait until the last possible election before the parcel tax is set to expire in order to start looking at renewal strategies, and particularly because the parcel tax requires that tough 2/3 vote. You need to make sure you have a plan A for how you want to move forward, but should you get 64, 65%, which in most elections is an overwhelming mandate. Unfortunately, in the world of parcel taxes under California law, you come up short. You want to have a plan B too, so you can fall back and make sure that parcel tax revenue continues. So tonight we'll talk through some different potential timeframes for when you might take a renewal measure to the ballot, how you would go about making some of the key decisions about what it is that you would put before voters, what sort of tax rate we think that the voters would support on an ongoing basis. Is there an opportunity to tweak some of the terms of your measure in terms of the duration? Virtually all of the other parcel taxes in Marin County include an automatic inflation adjustment. So during the 6, 8, 10 years that a parcel tax is in place, it automatically adjusts to make sure that the purchasing power of the parcel tax remains constant. So those are all pieces that we can look at as we go through this. So I will jump into the presentation here, and please feel free to ask questions as we go. So as we look ahead, as I mentioned, June of 2022 is sort of the magic date that's hanging out there in the future. That's the point by which we must have renewed this funding to ensure that you don't go at least a year without parcel tax revenue if that funding were to expire. So that leaves us several options for when we might put a parcel tax measure on the ballot. I've listed a number of them here so that we could talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each. This isn't an exhaustive list. There are other options that are legally available to you, but I think these are the ones that sort of rise to the level of serious consideration. The soonest you might consider going to the ballot is next March, a little less than a year away. The state legislature adopted legislation last year moving California's presidential primary from the normal June date to the March date. And I think this is going to probably have significant implications for voter participation. California is going to be very relevant in the national nominating process. Huge field of Democratic candidates that's probably going to generate quite a bit of interest around here in the Bay Area. So whereas our primary elections in California tend to be lower voter turnout, significantly lower than what we see in the general elections, I don't think that's going to be the case in 2020. I think you'll have a higher turnout election that generally brings more younger voters to the polls, oftentimes progressive voters, the kind of people that support school tax proposals. So we see a lot of districts that are thinking about parcel tax and bond measures, taking a close look at that March 2020 option. It's also important to note that in the primary election, you have far fewer competing measures on the same ballot. By definition, statewide initiatives must go to the November general election ballot unless the legislature adopts special legislation putting it on a different ballot. So, you know, those long ballots where we can have 15, 20 state issues plus a lot of local and regional issues, that tends to be more in November than in March. Another important factor is when the tax would actually take effect. So there's a deadline each year in the summer. It's in the July-August timeframe, by which you must submit to the county what your tax rates are to be assessed on property tax bills for the following year. So if we were to do a March 2020 election, that would allow your renewed and potentially adjusted measure with either a rate increase or cost of living adjustment, whatever we decide is feasible, to take effect in the 2020-2021 tax year. Once we get past March 2020, then we're going to go past that summer deadline. If we're looking at November of 2020 or an election beyond that, then the measure wouldn't take effect on property tax bills until the following year, so not till 2021-22. So a couple of things to think about there in terms of both sort of the electoral environment that you might be placing a measure on the ballot, but also when you would realize the proceeds from the measure that the voters would approve. If we don't think that the timing is right in 2020, because that is, a fair amount of time before the actual expiration of the measure, there is an option in 2021. This would be following the same time frame that we utilized in 2014 when we called a special mail-in ballot election for the parcel tax. So we could do that in May of 2021. That would still be in advance of that expiration in 2022. So a few different options to consider here. What we've done in the past is started the process of assessing the feasibility of a renewal measure early enough to keep multiple options on the table. And then we let the polling that we conduct and the outreach that we conduct guide our decisions about which is the optimal election for placing the measure on the ballot. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So the process that we followed for our prior successful measures here, and that most districts follow as they're thinking about a measure, involves several steps. But the steps can be grouped into a couple of key phases that are outlined in the different colors here. So the phases that are outlined in red here, which I'll walk through specifically, those are the steps that the district goes through to plan and prepare a measure for the ballot. And all of that is district-driven. It's not campaign community-driven. This is the process for figuring out what it is that you're going to put on the ballot, what's the right election date, how do you educate and inform the community about what the issues are that they're going to be asked to consider in the election, leading up to the board adopting the resolution calling for the election. And that's the point where we transition into the subsequent phase, which is the steps outlined in green there, which is the independent advocacy campaign. And I'm sure you all remember from the bond measure in 2016 and prior parcel tax elections, that's where volunteers have to be recruited, an independent campaign committee has to be formed, private dollars have to be raised to fund that advocacy effort, because by law, district resources cannot be used for that advocacy piece, okay? So most of what we're going to focus on here tonight are those steps outlined in red, which is the steps that the district would take to think about what it is that we're going to put on the ballot and when we would call for that election, because those subsequent phases, again, it has to be independent from the district. So digging in a little deeper into the individual steps, where we would start is with what we call a feasibility study. And this is where we try to answer the big picture questions as to, what might this measure look like? What's the best timing? And the centerpiece of that is some public opinion polling. So you probably remember from past measures, we've worked in collaboration with Godby Research, Brian Godby, to conduct a statistically reliable survey of the voters in your community to answer some key questions. We present potential parcel tax options to the voters, ask them about potential tax rates, ask them about potential program priorities to get a sense of where their priorities are and how they align with what the district might be thinking that it needs. And in comparing that data against the district's plans, that's how we refine our proposal to decide what we're going to actually take to the ballot. In that polling, we can model the voter turnout that we expect in those different elections that I summarized earlier, everything from the biggest turnout that we would expect in the presidential general election in November of 2020 to a slightly smaller universe that we would expect in the March primary election to an even smaller group of voters that would only vote in that special election potentially in May 2021. So that way we can look at head-to-head, how does the measure perform among those different groups of voters. Tax rate is obviously something that we'll be looking at. I think the sort of baseline objective here is to ensure that parcel tax funding continues at least that rate that you're currently collecting. But we want to take a close look at what the current needs are and what the projected needs of the district might be in the coming years, and see what tolerance there is in the community to adjust that rate to meet those needs. Looking at the program priorities in particular, traditionally your parcel tax is funded sort of a discrete set of items, attracting and retaining teachers, maintaining small class sizes. Some specific program areas, including athletics, have been sort of the focus of the parcel tax, but each time you take this back to the ballot for voters to weigh in again, it's an opportunity to revisit that. And I can tell you in the last couple of years, particularly here in the Bay Area, where cost of living for teachers and school employees has become such an issue, parcel taxes have taken on some focus on ensuring that compensation is competitive to allow teachers to live in the area. And we've seen that rise in the voters as a priority too. I can't for certain say that that's going to be the case here in Novato, but it's certainly something we could look at in polling. As part of the feasibility study, in addition to the polling, we're also looking at the broader political landscape. So I know that the County of Marin and other overlapping agencies may be thinking about tax proposals in 2020. What dates are they looking at? What's the nature of those proposals? To what extent do those compete with your proposal? We want to just be thinking about what that environment looks like. So we're taking the data, but also that broader analysis to think about what it is that we might put on the ballot. So assuming coming out of that feasibility study, we have a green light, it looks like we're moving forward, we have identified an election, the next step is to start the community outreach and the consensus building process. So first, making sure that internal audiences, your parents, your teachers, your staff, your booster organizations, PTAs and whatnot, are engaged, they're informed about this proposal, because as you know from past measures, they're a critical constituency to have involved in the effort, and especially as you get into the campaign. But then also make sure that we're reaching beyond those school audiences to engage with local elected leaders, business leaders, and others to build that broad consensus around your proposal well in advance of when you're on the ballot. This is also the phase where we can do some informational communication to the district, just to remind voters at large, we have this parcel tax, it's been in place for decades, it's a critical source of funding, and it's set to expire, right? So you set the stage on an informational level for the decision that they're going to have to make when the measure goes to the ballot. Any questions before I keep rolling? Yeah.
What's the normal, is there a normal number of years that districts put the parcel tax in place? I'm just trying to think, when we're talking dollar amount and stuff like that, I know we did 8 years, is it always 8? Is that like a standard or?
No, you'll see a range, and actually at the end of my presentation, there's a table showing all the other parcel taxes in Marin County, so you can kind of see by comparison. Some are a little longer, not a lot longer, 10, 12 years is about sort of the long end of the spectrum. There's a few fortunate school districts in California that have perpetual parcel taxes that never go away. Those are pretty rare and hard to get. Usually it's special circumstances when you can get something like that. But at the short end of the spectrum, the measure here in Novato started out as a 4-year proposal and was increased in subsequent renewals. So That's sort of the range. You're already at the longish end of the spectrum, so. And that's actually a great segue to the next stage in the process, which is taking everything that we've learned through the feasibility study and the consensus building outreach efforts to actually build that measure. So this is where we're taking what we've learned, what we've heard, working with your legal counsel to actually develop the resolution, the official ballot documents that will go before the voters to build in all that we've learned. And then that comes back to you for input and final consideration. And once you cast the vote to adopt that resolution calling for the election, that's where we make that important transition from the district planning effort, because now there's something on the ballot. Now it has to be a privately led advocacy effort to take the process through to election day. And I won't go into too much detail here about the advocacy campaign, because again, that is a separate independent effort, but private fundraising, traditional campaign strategies that you all are familiar with are critical for making sure that you get the message out, right? We need 2 yes votes for every no vote in a 2/3 election, so these are tough elections. You gotta use every strategy available to you, including, traditional communication to, the older voters that still receive their information in more traditional ways, plus, digital strategies to make sure that you're reaching voters through that way, to make sure that you're getting your message out thoroughly. And in particular, in the 2020 elections, where there's going to be a lot of noise, it's even more important to make sure you're being aggressive in getting that message out and cutting through that noise so people don't forget about the down ballot local measures like this one will be. Oops. I think I missed a slide here. These are out of order a little bit. But anyway, the last one is about get out the vote. We've had some close parcel tax elections here in Nevada, and I think the final analysis has showed in many of those elections that the final efforts to push our supporters and parents to turn out to vote disproportionately to the rest of the community has given us those margins to help us get over that tough 2/3 hurdle. And so that's always a critical piece, is making sure that the campaign has strategies to make sure that those key constituencies that oftentimes are less likely to vote on the natural turn out in these elections in significant numbers. Okay, so let's look at some specific timelines now. So the earliest election I think that we would consider placing a measure on the ballot is that March 2020 primary election. If you wanted to have a measure on that ballot, the deadline for the board to call for that election is December 6, 2019. So we sort of need to back up from there to allow time for us to complete the feasibility study, the polling that I talked about. We also have the summer months in there where it's going to be hard to do outreach to school communities. So what we're recommending is that we start that feasibility study as soon as possible so that we can get the key feasibility work done prior to the end of the school year while parents and others are still engaged. Because that will then, if it looks like a green light for March, that will allow us to come back in the fall and launch that outreach and consensus building effort in August, September, October, because December 6th deadline to adopt a resolution, thinking about Thanksgiving, you're probably looking at late October, early November board action to actually call that election. There's time to do March 2020 well, but there's not time to waste. So if we want to do that, we would need to be getting going here pretty soon. The other thing to think about related to the March election is that from election day back up, the time when you would normally be planning and preparing your campaign starts to back up into the holidays. So you also want to make sure you've given adequate notice to your parent leaders and others that are going to lead that campaign effort so that, well in advance of the holidays, they're starting to get the committee formed, start the fundraising effort, volunteer recruitment, et cetera. November 2020, then our deadline to qualify for the ballot is at the beginning of August. So we have a little bit more time. I would suggest that you would still want to do that feasibility study on the same time frame in order to evaluate both options and then make a decision which ballot presents the best opportunity for being successful. You're just going to have more time for that consensus building and outreach effort before the deadline comes, and also more time to give the community advocates to prepare a campaign before launching into a campaign for the fall of 2020. And then the last, if we think that 2020 isn't the right time frame and 2021 is where we should set our sights, we have some time there. And in that case, I would suggest that we really don't need to launch that feasibility study until about a year from now. And in between the March and November elections next year would be the time to do some polling and start preparing for placing a measure on the ballot in May of 2021, because that deadline for the board action to qualify for that ballot is in early February of 2021. So some different options there for you to consider. We also put our projections of voter turnout there for those elections so you can see what those look like. So lastly, this is hard to read on the screen, but this is a table that just summarizes all the other parcel taxes in Marin County. In recent years, some of the southern Marin districts have passed some pretty big parcel taxes, so those rates are getting pretty high. Virtually all the other, I think all the other districts have cost of living adjustment factors built in, as you can see. So this is really just for comparison's sake. Just because these other districts are able to get their voters to say yes to these doesn't mean that Nevada voters will say yes, but I think it's interesting to see what the comparisons are. And most of the other districts in the county are non-unified, so most of those taxpayers are paying both an elementary tax and a high school tax for their overlapping districts. And in combination, they're pretty significant amounts, in some cases well over $1,000 per year per parcel. Part of the polling could be to test some of those comparisons. In order for Novato kids to keep up, we have to make sure that we're providing similar resources for the education that our students receive. As that disparity starts to grow, that might be a compelling argument to your community. So, anyway, with that, happy to answer any questions you have or talk more about the process.
Okay, great. Trustee Millerick?
Early question. If we go out early, in these range of dates, if we choose to go earlier, does that mean this whole thing ends earlier? I mean, if it's a 6-year parcel, the sooner we go, the sooner it ends. Is that the math?
Usually the way these measures are written is that the measure that the voters are adopting replaces the old measure. And the reason for that is usually one of the reasons why you're going out early is because you're trying to increase the rate or lock in some new feature of the measure. And so you want that to start sooner rather than later. You're not required to do that. You can certainly write the measure so that it basically picks up where the old one lets off. The only circumstance where that really makes sense is if you're not increasing the rate, you're just extending it, and you want it to pick up where the old one leaves off, so you're maximizing the amount of time it's in place, just for continuity.
And could you speak to concerns about the projections of the economy and uncertainties versus how far into the future that plays?
Yeah, I mean, with each passing day, we're into the longest uninterrupted growth cycle in our economy's history. So there's a recession out there someplace, and if I could predict that accurately, I probably wouldn't be standing here right now. I think what we do know is that the longer we go out, the harder it is to project what things are going to be like. So that's one of the reasons why I would advise doing some of the polling and research sooner rather than later to check out those sooner election dates, because the further we get in the future, the greater that uncertainty grows. And just because the economy slows doesn't mean parcel taxes are impossible to pass. I mean, I was looking back at our data from 2014. The economy was still coming out of that economic downturn at that point. Certainly when we did parcel taxes in 2004, 2005 here, that was sort of coming out of the dot-com bust in the early 2000s. So there's a track record of being successful here, both in good times and more challenging times. But certainly when voters are concerned about pocketbook issues, they become more conservative around tax rates and the duration and those kinds of things. So usually, when people are feeling confident about the economy, those are the opportunities to, be a little more aggressive on the rate and such.
One more comment. Many of the companies in the industry I'm involved in are moving into initial public offerings, and there's a pile of cash flowing into people's pockets who can buy properties, and it appears, at least in this short run, property values are moving up pretty quickly. I know other people, Shelley and others, have said they expect that's going to turn and change, but in the immediate short run, Uber and Yelp and Lyft are changing the economics in downtown San Francisco right now.
All right, any other further clarification, question? I have one comment card, so I'm going to go to that if nobody has. Okay. Alan Harris, welcome.
Thank you very much. I have some materials for the superintendent and the members of the board. If I could ask. Pass these
Yeah, we'll
down.
pass them down, yeah.
I think there's 7 copies.
Thank you.
8 copies including the superintendent's. I've been attending the City of Novato's public hearings on district city council elections and passing this information on to Yancey Hawkins, who's a point person on staff here. And I wanted to share with you some materials. Exhibit A was attached to the city resolution, which is now a couple of months old. And it, in short order, describes what they have directed their consultants and demographers to do in preparing district maps. And number 8 is the item on that exhibit that I want to call your attention to. Unless otherwise required by law, the electoral districts shall be created using whole census blocks. And the reason for this is that the population data is available by census blocks, and the law requires that the districts be relatively equal in size, plus or minus, I think, 5%. The green draft is one of 4 district maps that the city consultants released yesterday afternoon. Yancey has a full set of those, although I don't see them tonight.
No, and Alan, let me ask you something, and I don't want to
Yeah.
discourage you from anything, but tonight we're discussing the parcel tax election and looking at possibly our current parcel tax and what does it look like it's going to be expiring in 2022.
Great.
On the 23rd, we are going to be discussing this topic.
Let's hold this.
I think it would be best,
Yeah,
it's the
fine.
right place to do that, if you're okay
Great.
with that.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I'll be here on the 23rd.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I know the city has all of their maps online already. They're giving the public an opportunity to look at those prior to their meeting on Tuesday. It's already up, all of the maps, and this is one of them that
Okay.
you're presenting, so.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, we appreciate you bringing this. Sorry about that. So if you guys could just hold on to your copy of what he's presented, or you can give them back to me, and we can bring them back next week. But on next week's agenda is this topic, is the demographer and some other things regarding our district elections. Okay, back to the parcel tax. And so tonight, tonight we've all been through this before. Diane's been very part of the campaign, not as a board member, but definitely part of the parcel tax campaign. We're all familiar with the process. We wanted to bring this to the board to kind of do a little study session and kick things off and see where we are and what we have to do to potentially renew our parcel tax or not. And one of those things is doing the feasibility study. As we know, Brian Gottby Research does that for us and has for many years. That's probably the starting point for us. So I kind of am interested in the board's thoughts. I'm sure staff is interested in the board's thought on looking at a feasibility study. So I would maybe start there, and what does that look like if the board has questions regarding that. Anybody, go right ahead. This is more of an open conversation.
I actually have a question, not to be negative, but what happens if, so the last time in your plan here is May 2021. So if for some reason we wait and we do that, what's our option after that? Then November 2021?
Yeah, so in the odd-numbered years, you don't have the regularly scheduled primary and general elections, but there are special election dates. There's several of them in the year when you could come back and put a measure on the ballot. But then you would also have the elections in the first half of 2022. So you would have March and May available to you in 2022 as well.
Okay.
So as long as you achieve that voter approval before June of 2022, the parcel tax will continue uninterrupted. But as I was mentioning earlier, you probably want to save that fail-safe option at the end, just in case you go out once and you come up short.
Right, which is why I was asking whether there was after that.
Yeah, these election dates are essentially for Plan A, so to speak, and then it leaves you the second bite of the apple should you need it.
Okay, yeah. Trustee Millerick and then Trustee Nell, if you.
Perhaps the superintendent knows how much revenue each year do we recognize from the parcel program?
$4 million.
$4 million. So we just got through doing a budget cut exercise, and how much were we cutting? About 1.8 million?
Yeah.
To start.
Right?
So if parcel tax stops because either the community decides we're not trustworthy or we don't run the campaign effectively, the budget cuts of $1.8 million is half of the number of budget cuts that we have to immediately implement in this district if the first parcel tax ends before the next one starts. So I'm want to make sure we have enough safety margin in the process as a general rule. But that's risk management. The bigger concern to me is that we have the conversation here in the community to make sure we understand the community understands us, and credit to Leslie Benjamin and the hard work she's been doing in terms of public relations, thank you, in terms of outreach. If we're not in sync with our community and they're not prepared to stand up and support the mission that we've organized, this falls flat on its face. So the sooner we have and the more frequently we understand our community, the better off we are. So, and I think there's some changes in Novato compared to 4 years ago. I think we're seeing houses turn over. I think we're seeing social issues defined differently than they have been before. I think the way you communicate to the population is different. The Marin IJ's voice does not have the voice as strong, or the Novato Advance's voice is not as strong as it was in years past. So I think we need to be doing more sooner than later. So I would suggest moving sooner, but I would also suggest that we take some time and be really clear about how we communicate to how we understand our community's needs, so they'll support us. I think it needs to be a stronger research than we have in the past, because I think we're in transition.
I agree.
I think Nevada in transition.
We need to put some time into this. The preliminary work needs some time,
Yeah,
right?
So
Not-
it's just words of caution, and I think we have time to act.
I appreciate that, yeah. Trustee Nell, did you have something? Yeah.
I'm approaching this from a similar perspective that it's time to get started, and obviously every step of the way is going to require fastidious study and discussion and transparency and outreach. So the more time, the better is how I'm looking at it. So actually, my question is, can you go into a little bit more detail on the feasibility study? Poll is, the generic term, but how have they changed in Facebook? How cell phones, younger generation? Tell us a little bit more about what changes to expect in a feasibility study.
Sure. 15 years ago, the surveys that Brian Godby was conducting for you were conducted entirely by landline. They were able to get 400 registered voters that fit the demographic profile of your community to actually answer their landline. And trust me, you couldn't do that today. So that's the big thing that has evolved, is how you reach people. And so now he's recruiting his interviews. He still does get some portion of them through the landline, but it's quickly diminishing. He's also calling cell phones and conducting phone interviews via the cell phone, but he's also sending emails to known registered voters and text messages to known registered voters with a unique link that they can click through and then take the survey online. And that's where the vast majority of the surveys are completed now. I mean, the content of the survey is always evolving every year just based on what the nature of the issues are, what's going on in the community, what the specifics in a given district might be. So, that's always evolving and changing. And I think, we have good historical data here as to, what were Nevada voters thinking prior to some of our past successful elections. We'll want to ask some of those same questions so that we can kind of see the trend line data and see how have things changed. But then there's also all the new issues that you're speaking to that we want to make sure we're capturing as well, because communities do change. It'll be interesting too because we have all the data on the voters that we're interviewing, and one of the pieces of information we can look at is their registration date. How long have they been registered to vote here? So that'll be sort of interesting to look at. Is there a difference in opinions between old Novato and new Novato and some of those issues? So there's a lot of ways to parse the data that is probably useful to you far beyond this election, but just understanding your constituency.
So just to follow on, and there's a lot to be said for the polling data. I work in the marketing arena, and we have a saying that we like to make decisions based on evidence. And that evidence does come to us through polls and test groups and test marketing campaigns, actually. So I think it's the right approach, and I think, without going back and checking, I think it's been fairly accurate. The Godspeed polls in the past. So
Yeah.
As long as we're assured that he's keeping up with the times, that type of thing, little due diligence there,
Great
I
question.
think
I'm
it's
glad you
time
asked
to seriously consider. Obviously, we got to go through a few steps before we can
Right.
decide to do this, but I think it's
Right.
time to ask staff to come back with a plan.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else want to chime in? Trustee Gasson?
One of the things, kind of touching on some of what you were mentioning, in terms of how things have changed, I've noticed that I think there's a shift in what parents in the community would like to see the parcel tax pay for. Not to say we just, throw out everything that we've been paying for with it, but, mental health services comes to mind, and throwing some things in that I think would be of help and of interest to the community, and kind of revamping it a little bit. So I only pause when I look at the timeline, because I think, I'd like to have some things, that's pre-work, and their polling, as I understand it, will also go out and ask about those types of things. Like, what is the interest in the community, and getting a little bit of a shift in what we've been doing in the past.
I think you're right. I think there's changes coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Trustee
Well-
Aguila, do you want to? Oh, yes.
Well, I was just
Trustee
going to follow on to that. I mean, that's more or less part of the question here, and I'm not sure that you can answer for Godspeed, but essentially, part of the process normally ought to be an opportunity to get some input from us and other community stakeholders as to what to go out and pull for, as well as their professional opinion and research into the area, so that they're probably right there on the mental health issue, for example, would be
Yeah.
something that they would, I can't say for sure, but I'm sure they're aware of it. Whether they recommend we ask or not is probably something that we'll wait for the data scientists to conclude. And this, polling, actually, it's fairly sophisticated scientific approach, and so I think we'll be happy with the results. But there are steps involved where you get a chance to discuss what you think is important, and I'm sure we could come to some consensus on what we want to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have
Yeah,
something to say.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I know that we talked about this would be a possible a solution to our budget problems. You mentioned other things, was to close the school and to increase class size. Is there anything else besides this? I'm still not wanting to do this because I don't want to. I don't want to have to ask our community for more money if we don't have to. Anything else that I know these were your top three. Do you have a fourth thing coming up?
There's a lot of things we're going to need to look at again. I would say the two, closing a school and looking at the parcel tax, are probably our biggest sources of revenue with the parcel tax, and also with saving expenditures. I think the range from closing a school was 300 to 400, somewhere in there. And we've been making as many of those small cuts as we can. The other place to go is staffing, right? So staffing closer to the formula because we're a people business. And so really those three things, our staffing levels, the parcel tax, and closing a school are where we're going to have to go next, because we are going to have to continue to make probably at least $2 million in cuts for the next 2 or 3 years. I mean, we've got $1 million that we're losing in revenue from declining enrollment, and we're going to still be putting $1 million aside for STRS and PERS. So I think for the next 2 or 3 years, if you're looking at that amount of money of $2 million a year, we're going to have to start looking at those bigger numbers, and this would be one of those things. So, but going back to, I think what the board has been saying is whether you decide to go out for the parcel tax early or whether to increase it or not, the polling information is really important because it lets us know how we're doing with the community and what perceptions the community has. And we, whether those perceptions are positive in some areas or negative, it tells us that, so we know what to address. And when we're developing our marketing strategies, or we want to know what the community thinks of how we're doing, that polling data, again, whenever you decide to go out after that is, or if you decide to go out after that ahead of time, is a decision down the line. But I think going ahead with the polling and finding out where we stand and what are the different kinds of things that the community might be interested in having the parcel tax support would be, I think, a really important next step. And I think the sooner the better.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and I'm in agreement with starting this sooner. I think we need to put more work into it than what we have in the past, and really understanding what this community is interested in supporting and what's important to them. So I think the next steps, if the board is fine, is to inform Brian Gottby that we're interested in moving forward on this. Correct me if I'm wrong, and come up with what that next step will be in regards to what the survey will look like and the questions that will be asked.
Yeah.
So.
And in the past, what we've had a sort of subcommittee that included staff, a couple of board members to look at the different issues that we want to test in the poll, work closely with Brian to develop a survey draft, then
Right.
everyone can review it and provide input. So I think that's where we would go next.
Okay, yep, and add something?
So next week we'll bring back a proposal for you to look at, which would have kind of a timeline and all that, as well as the cost of how much it would cost. Then we'll bring that back for your consideration next Tuesday.
Yep,
I agree with that approach.
yes.
I think the work that Leslie's been doing in terms of positioning in the community has been critical, and I would be interested in, and we have a consulting firm in to help us review our public outreach. I would like to make sure if there's any more area that we're covering that area, well, we need to learn every lesson there is to learn now, because in the next, whatever this takes, 24 months is
Right.
going to be the most critical time for this district. So I guess this is not a request for an action to come back to the board, Jim, but for you to think through and maybe double down on that strategy to make sure we're running this organization with as an effective outreach a program as possible, because I really believe it's a changing community, and and we're changing as well. The question is, are we staying in touch effectively like we should be?
I have another question.
I would rather spend extra effort on that now as opposed to regret
Right.
it 2
Absolutely.
years from now.
Okay. Trustee Gila?
And you mentioned about the economy. And so we have the 3 choices or several choices, between now and 2020, 2021. So what are your thoughts as far as the economy, when the people would say that? Because I know it was said today that if people don't support us, it's because they don't trust us. I don't believe that. I think it could be for many reasons. And so one of them would be the economy. And so I wanted to get your input about what timeline do you think, if you can compare it to the economy?
Yeah, and certainly there's multiple factors that influence how people think about these issues and how they might vote on it. One is sort of trust in the agency that's asking for the dollars, but also how are they feeling about their own personal economic situation. So you have to kind of look at all of those. You can't look at just one dimension. And none of us have a perfect crystal ball for what's going to happen with the economy, but I think that if we keep a sooner election on the table and the economy continues to grow, then there's an opportunity there because at some point the economy is going to turn. None of us know exactly when that's going to be, but if we have a sooner election on the table and the economy continues to be strong, then we wanted to be able to take advantage of that. But if we wait to start the planning process, that opportunity could slip away.
So the economy is strong now, and hopefully it will continue to be strong. And so you're suggesting we do it now?
Well, there are things that
Since
we
this
can
economy
control,
is
and there are
strong.
things beyond our control. And clearly, the economy is one of those things that are beyond our control. So all you can do really is start the planning process and be prepared to react to circumstances. And you have some of those key deadlines by which the board has to make a decision about, are you going to the ballot or not? And you monitor the circumstances as best you can until you reach that decision point.
So go for it now, since the economy is strong. Okay.
It's part of it.
Well, yeah.
Have your ducks in a row, and then you can.
If we have to make adjustments, we have time to make those adjustments. Yeah.
No, I said you can kill the duck, or so you get your ducks in the row, and you either have them go forward, or you can just hold up and not do anything. But I think with that.
Okay, if there's no other comments or questions, I think we're gonna wrap this up. And the only reason I feel like we're so short, but I mean, we are very familiar with this item, and we understand the process. And to have Charles Heath here from TBWB as a familiar face in this process, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You know our district.
And I assume we're proceeding with Mr. Godby as well, although he's not physically standing behind the podium.
Right, you're still in partnership with
we're a
him.
team.
Yeah, you're a team, and obviously any work we do with
Half Moon
Brian.
Bay's not that far away. I don't know why he couldn't make it.
A contract will come forward for either one of them, both of them, once we move through this process. All right, thank you for being here.
Thanks.
And I would like to adjourn this meeting in honor of Leslie Peterson Schwartz and Rick Warnick.